The night sky stretched endlessly above me, a blanket of stars that usually brought comfort during my late shifts at the radio observatory. I'd been working there for almost 3 years, monitoring deep space frequencies and cataloging the usual cosmic background noise. Most nights were predictable: distant pulsars, solar wind interference, the occasional satellite bleed-through, nothing that would make headlines or change anyone's life. But that October evening started differently. I was alone in the facility, as I often was during the graveyard shift, when the equipment began picking up something unusual. At first, I thought it was just another glitch in our aging receiver array. The signal appeared around 2:17 a.m., a faint rhythmic pattern buried beneath layers of static. It wasn't random noise or natural phenomena. There was structure to it, intentionality. I leaned forward in my chair, adjusting the frequency filters and trying to isolate the source. The pattern became clearer, more defined. It pulsed in groups of 7, paused for exactly 4 seconds, then repeated, over and over, with mechanical precision. I'd never encountered anything like it in all my years of monitoring space communications. My first instinct was to check for terrestrial sources: military communications, encrypted satellite feeds, even amateur radio operators experimenting with new protocols. But the signal's characteristics didn't match any known transmission methods. The frequency was wrong, the modulation too clean, and the power levels suggested an origin far beyond Earth's atmosphere. I started recording everything, documenting the signal strength, frequency drift, and timing patterns. Standard procedure required me to report unusual findings to my supervisor, but something held me back. This felt different, significant in a way I couldn't articulate. The signal had an almost hypnotic quality, drawing me deeper into its mathematical elegance. Around 3:45 a.m., the pattern changed. The groups of 7 became groups of 11, then 13, then 17, prime numbers. I felt my heart rate increase as the implications hit me. Natural phenomena don't broadcast prime number sequences. This was artificial, intelligent, deliberate. I tried triangulating the source using our directional antenna array, but the readings were inconsistent. The signal seemed to originate from multiple points simultaneously, as if it were being relayed or amplified by something in our solar system. When I finally got a rough bearing, it pointed toward the outer edge of the asteroid belt, where no known satellites or space missions were operating. The transmission continued for another hour, cycling through increasingly complex mathematical sequences, Fibonacci numbers, perfect squares, even what appeared to be the first few digits of pi encoded in the pulse timing. Whatever was sending this signal wanted to demonstrate intelligence, to prove it understood universal mathematical concepts. Then, just as abruptly as it had begun, the signal stopped. The frequency band went silent, returning to the familiar hiss of cosmic background radiation. I sat in the sudden quiet, staring at my recordings and wondering if I'd just witnessed the most important discovery in human history. I spent the rest of my shift analyzing the data, running it through every filter and algorithm I could think of. The signal remained consistent, unexplainable by conventional means. No satellite malfunction or atmospheric interference could account for what I'd recorded. This was something else entirely. When my supervisor arrived the next morning, I showed him the recordings. He listened politely, examined the data, and suggested it was probably interference from a classified military project. Standard procedure was to file a report and move on, but I couldn't move on. The signal had changed something fundamental in my understanding of our place in the universe. Over the following weeks, I monitored the same frequency range obsessively, hoping for another transmission. Nothing came. The silence felt heavier now, pregnant with possibility. I began researching similar incidents, diving deep into obscure scientific journals and declassified government documents. What I found was a pattern of suppressed discoveries, careers quietly ended, and evidence systematically buried. I started keeping my own records at home, documenting everything I'd learned about that night. The mathematical sequences, the transmission characteristics, the implications for human civilization. I knew I might never hear that signal again, but I also knew I'd been chosen to witness something extraordinary. Sometimes, late at night when I'm alone with the equipment, I think about that intelligence reaching across the void. Were they testing us, measuring our readiness for contact? Or was it simply a beacon, announcing their presence to anyone sophisticated enough to recognize it? I may never know the answers, but I'll keep listening, keep watching the stars, waiting for the night when they decide to speak again. The universe is vast and full of mysteries we're only beginning to comprehend. That October night taught me that we're not alone, that somewhere in the darkness between worlds, intelligence is watching, waiting, perhaps even trying to communicate. The signal may have lasted only a few hours, but its implications will echo through the rest of my life. I've heard the voice of the cosmos, and it was speaking directly to us, continuing from where the technician left off, documenting his profound encounter with what he believed was evidence of extraterrestrial intelligence. The documentation weighed heavily on me in the days that followed. I found myself obsessively reviewing the data, cross-referencing the signal patterns against every known astronomical phenomenon. Nothing matched. The mathematical precision, the deliberate sequencing, the way it seemed to respond to our equipment, all of it pointed to something far beyond our current understanding. Sleep became elusive. When I did manage to drift off, I was haunted by dreams of vast cosmic networks, invisible highways of communication stretching between distant worlds. The signal had opened a door in my mind, one that I couldn't seem to close. I began to wonder if that brief contact had changed something fundamental about how I perceived reality. During my next shift 3 nights later, I maintained a vigilant watch on the same frequency range. The hours crawled by with nothing but the usual cosmic background radiation. Then, at precisely 2:17 a.m., the exact time of the original transmission, the equipment began registering faint anomalies. Not the structured signal from before, but subtle fluctuations that seemed almost like echoes or reverberations. I immediately began recording, adjusting the sensitivity to capture even the most minute variations. What I discovered chilled me to the bone. Hidden within the static were fragments of the original transmission, playing back in random sequences like a broken record. It was as if the signal had somehow imprinted itself onto the fabric of space itself, leaving behind traces that our instruments could barely detect. The implications were staggering. If an extraterrestrial civilization could embed persistent signals into the electromagnetic spectrum, what else might they be capable of? Were they already here, operating on frequencies and dimensions we couldn't even perceive? The thought that we might be surrounded by an invisible presence, watching and waiting, sent shivers down my spine. I compiled everything into a comprehensive report. The original signal data, the echo phenomena, my analysis of the mathematical patterns. This time, I bypassed my immediate supervisor and sent it directly to the director of the observatory. The response came back within hours, a terse message instructing me to report to the administrative office first thing Monday morning. That meeting changed everything. The director, flanked by 2 individuals in dark suits who never introduced themselves, made it clear that my discoveries were to remain classified. They spoke of national security implications, of the potential for public panic, of the need to maintain scientific credibility. My data was confiscated, my access to certain equipment was revoked, and I was reassigned to routine maintenance duties. But they couldn't erase what I had experienced, what I knew to be true. The universe had revealed one of its most profound secrets to me, and no amount of bureaucratic intimidation could make me forget. I began keeping detailed personal notes hidden away from prying eyes, documenting not just the technical aspects of what I had observed, but the profound sense of connection I had felt during those brief moments of contact. Months passed, and the official silence around the incident only reinforced my conviction that something extraordinary had occurred. I started reaching out to other researchers, carefully probing to see if anyone else had encountered similar phenomena. What I discovered was a network of scientists and technicians who had all experienced their own brushes with the impossible. Signals that defied explanation, data that was quickly suppressed, questions that were met with uncomfortable silence. The truth was out there, literally, broadcasting across the cosmos. We had made contact, however briefly, with an intelligence that spanned the void between stars. The fact that it had been covered up, dismissed, and buried only made me more determined to continue listening. Somewhere, in the vast expanse of space, they were still transmitting, still hoping to connect with civilizations like ours, and I would be ready when they called again. Aliens in the Woods, True Nighttime. Scary Stories, Part 3. The night Jennifer Wilson first encountered the beings, she was working as a medical researcher at a university lab. She'd been pulling late shifts, analyzing blood samples that had been submitted from various rural hospitals across the state. The samples were part of a study on an unusual anemia that seemed to be affecting small communities in remote areas. It was just past 2 a.m. when she noticed something peculiar about the latest batch. Under the microscope, the red blood cells appeared normal at first glance, but there was something else present. Tiny, geometric structures that didn't belong in human blood. They were crystalline, almost artificial-looking, with perfect symmetry that nature rarely produced. Jennifer had been studying hematology for over a decade, and she'd never seen anything like these formations. They weren't parasites or bacteria. They seemed to be some kind of nanoscale technology, though that was impossible. The samples had come from people in areas where the most advanced technology was probably a decade-old smartphone. She documented everything meticulously, taking hundreds of photographs and detailed notes. The structures appeared to be inactive, just floating among the blood cells like microscopic debris. But when she applied an electrical current to one of the samples, something extraordinary happened. The structures began to move. Not randomly, but with purpose. They arranged themselves into complex patterns almost like circuitry. The blood cells around them started to change too, becoming more efficient at carrying oxygen, more resistant to damage. It was as if these tiny machines were upgrading the human body from the inside. Jennifer worked through the night, running test after test. Every sample from the affected areas contained these structures. The patients themselves reported feeling better than they had in years. Stronger, more alert, with improved immune systems. Whatever these things were, they seemed to be helping rather than harming. But who had created them? And how were they getting into people's bloodstreams? The answer came 3 nights later, when Jennifer decided to visit one of the affected communities herself. She drove to a small town called Cedar Falls, population 800, nestled deep in the Appalachian Mountains. The town was so remote that her GPS lost signal halfway there, and she had to navigate using an old paper map. She arrived just as the sun was setting, painting the surrounding forests in shades of orange and gold. The town seemed normal enough. A few small shops, a diner, a gas station. The people she met were friendly but reserved, the way small town folks often were with strangers. Jennifer checked into the only motel in town and waited. If the blood samples were any indication, something was happening here at night. something that was changing people on a cellular level. She didn't have to wait long. Around midnight, she was awakened by a soft humming sound. It was barely audible, more felt than heard, like the vibration of a tuning fork pressed against her chest. She looked out her motel room window and saw lights moving through the forest. Not flashlights or vehicle headlights, but something else entirely. The lights were pale blue and seemed to float independently, weaving between the trees in perfect formation. As they moved, the humming grew stronger. Jennifer could see people emerging from their homes, walking calmly toward the forest. Their movements were synchronized, purposeful, but not robotic. They looked peaceful, almost serene. Jennifer grabbed her camera and followed at a distance. The procession of townspeople moved through the woods along what appeared to be a well-worn path. The floating lights led them deeper into the forest, to a clearing she never would have found on her own. In the center of the clearing was a structure that defied explanation. It wasn't built so much as grown, with organic curves that seemed to flow like water, frozen in time. The surface was smooth and reflective, like polished metal, but it pulsed with that same pale blue light she'd seen in the forest. The townspeople arranged themselves in concentric circles around the structure. They stood quietly, eyes closed, faces turned upward toward the star-filled sky. The humming grew louder, and Jennifer felt something strange happening to her own body. A tingling sensation, like every cell was vibrating in harmony with the sound. That's when she saw them. They descended from the sky slowly, gracefully, as if the air itself was supporting them. Tall, slender figures with elongated limbs and smooth, featureless faces. Their skin had that same reflective quality as the structure, and they moved with an otherworldly elegance that was both beautiful and terrifying. Jennifer crouched behind a fallen log, hardly daring to breathe. She raised her camera, but the device wouldn't function. The screen flickered and went dark, as if the presence of these beings disrupted electronic equipment. The beings moved among the townspeople, not touching them, but somehow interacting with them nonetheless. Jennifer could see streams of that pale blue light flowing between the beings and the humans. It was then she understood what she was witnessing. This wasn't an invasion or abduction, it was an exchange. The beings were sharing something with the humans, technology perhaps, or knowledge encoded in those microscopic structures she'd found in the blood samples. In return, the humans were providing something the beings needed. Jennifer couldn't tell what, but she sensed it was given willingly. The process lasted about an hour. When it was complete, the beings began to ascend back into the sky, moving with the same fluid grace with which they'd arrived. The townspeople remained in their circles for a few more minutes, then slowly began to disperse, walking back through the forest toward their homes. Jennifer waited until she was certain everyone had gone before approaching the structure. Up close, it was even more impressive. The surface was warm to the touch and seemed to pulse with its own heartbeat. As she placed her palm against it, images flashed through her mind. She saw the being's home world, a planet where technology and biology had merged into something beautiful and sustainable. She saw their long journey through space, searching not for conquest but for partnership. They were gardeners of sorts, helping species evolve and grow, sharing their knowledge in exchange for the unique perspectives that each civilization could offer. Humanity, they had decided, was ready for the next step. The structure began to fade as Jennifer watched, becoming translucent and then disappearing entirely. The clearing looked like any other patch of forest, with no sign that anything extraordinary had taken place there. Jennifer returned to her motel room in a daze. She tried to process what she'd witnessed, to reconcile it with everything she thought she knew about the world. The blood samples made sense now. The beings were slowly introducing their technology into human physiology, preparing people for a larger transformation. But why the secrecy? Why not reveal themselves openly? The answer came to her as she lay in bed, staring at the ceiling. Humanity wasn't ready for open contact. The fear, the panic, the inevitable attempts to weaponize alien technology would destroy any chance of peaceful cooperation. So the beings worked quietly, patiently, starting with small communities where trust could be built gradually. Jennifer realized she faced a choice. She could report her findings, try to expose what was happening, but that would likely end the program and rob humanity of an incredible opportunity. Or she could keep silent, become part of the conspiracy of protection that seemed to surround these encounters. She thought about the townspeople she'd seen, how healthy and peaceful they'd appeared. The blood samples showed clear improvements in immune function, cellular regeneration, even neural connectivity. Whatever the beings were doing, it seemed to be helping. In the end, Jennifer made her decision. She returned to the university and filed a report stating that the unusual blood samples were the result of a previously unknown mineral deficiency common to certain geographic areas. Her recommendations for further study were quietly shelved, and the research funding was redirected to other projects. But Jennifer kept copies of everything: the photographs, the blood work, her detailed notes about that night in the forest. She locked them away in a safe deposit box, along with a letter explaining everything she'd witnessed. Someday, she reasoned, when humanity was ready, the truth would need to be told. Until then, she would watch and wait, hoping that the beings' patience would be rewarded with the partnership they sought. Years passed, and Jennifer continued her research, though in different areas now. She occasionally noticed news stories about unusual health improvements in remote communities, always accompanied by rational explanations that didn't quite add up. She recognized the pattern, the careful management of information that kept the truth hidden while allowing the work to continue. Sometimes, on clear nights, she would step outside and look up at the stars. She never saw the pale blue lights again, but she often felt that familiar humming in her chest, so faint it might have been her imagination. It reminded her that somewhere out there, patient gardeners were tending to the future of humanity, one small town at a time. The blood samples in her old files remained unchanged, those tiny geometric structures still visible under high magnification. They were dormant now, waiting for some signal to activate. Jennifer sometimes wondered if she carried them too, if that night in the forest had changed her in ways she couldn't detect. She hoped it had. Whatever was coming, whatever transformation the beings were preparing humanity for, she wanted to be part of it. The old world, with its conflicts and limitations, was dying. Something new was being born, and those who had witnessed the early stages of that birth were privileged to be midwives to the future. On her last day at the university, as she cleaned out her office, Jennifer found herself thinking about Cedar Falls. She wondered if the town was still there, if the people she'd seen that night were still healthy and peaceful. She thought about driving back, just to see, but decided against it. Some things were better left undisturbed. The beings knew what they were doing, and they didn't need her interference. Her role had been to witness and to keep their secrets safe. She had done both, and that was enough. As she walked to her car, carrying the last box of her personal belongings, Jennifer felt that familiar humming one more time. She smiled and looked up at the afternoon sky, wondering if somewhere among those invisible stars, patient eyes were watching her with approval. The transformation was coming, whether humanity was ready or not, and Jennifer Wilson had played her small part in making sure it would be as gentle as possible. The call came in just after midnight, standard procedure for unusual aircraft reports, but this one felt different from the moment I picked up the radio. Control Tower was tracking something that didn't belong in our airspace, and they needed eyes on it immediately. I'd been flying military aircraft for over 15 years, seen everything from experimental jets to weather balloons that looked suspicious in the dark. Nothing prepared me for what happened that night. We scrambled 3 F-18s from the base, standard formation for unidentified contact. The sky was clear, perfect visibility, moon hanging like a spotlight over the desert below. About 40 miles out, my radar started acting strange. The blip we were tracking would appear, then vanish, then reappear somewhere it shouldn't be. Physics doesn't work that way. Objects don't teleport across 20 miles of sky in the blink of an eye. That's when I saw it with my own eyes. At first, I thought it was another aircraft, maybe one of ours running dark. But as we closed distance, the shape became impossible to explain. It was triangular, massive, easily the size of a football field. No running lights, no engine noise, no heat signature on infrared. Just this dark mass hanging in the sky like it owned the place. The thing moved wrong. When I say moved, I mean it defied everything I knew about aerodynamics. No acceleration curves, no banking into turns. It would simply be in one position, then another, like someone was editing reality in real time. My wingman radioed that his instruments were going haywire. Compass spinning, altimeter reading impossible numbers, GPS showing we were somehow flying through solid ground. Then it acknowledged us. I'll never forget that moment. The craft rotated slowly, deliberately, until what I can only describe as its front was facing our formation. That's when the communication started, not over radio, not through any equipment we had. The voice was inside my head, clear as if someone was sitting next to me in the cockpit. It wasn't threatening, wasn't demanding anything, just curious, asking questions about our world, our people, our intentions. My squadron leader tried to establish radio contact, running through standard protocols for unknown aircraft. The responses came not through our headsets, but directly into our thoughts. We were being studied, evaluated, like specimens under a microscope. The being, whatever it was, seemed genuinely interested in understanding why we flew these machines, what drove us to venture into the sky. There was an intelligence there that felt ancient, patient, completely unlike anything human. The conversation lasted maybe 10 minutes, though time felt elastic during the encounter. We learned they'd been observing us for decades, watching our technological progress with the same detachment scientists might show studying ants. They weren't hostile, just gathering information. Our planet was one of many they monitored, part of some vast catalog of developing civilizations scattered across the galaxy. When the exchange ended, the craft simply faded away, not flew off, not accelerated into the distance. It became translucent, like watching smoke dissipate, until there was nothing but empty sky where something impossible had been floating moments before. Our instruments snapped back to normal readings. Radio chatter resumed from the control tower, asking for our status report. The debriefing lasted 6 hours. Men in suits who never gave their names or agencies, asking the same questions over and over. What did we see? What did we hear? What did we think happened? When we mentioned the telepathic communication, the room went quiet. They'd heard this before clearly. This wasn't our first contact, just our first contact. We were sworn to secrecy, transferred to different bases within the month, told our careers depended on forgetting what happened that night. But you don't forget something like that. You don't forget the feeling of touching minds with something so far beyond human understanding that our entire civilization feels like children playing with toys. I retired from active duty 2 years later. Couldn't shake the knowledge that we're not alone, that we're being watched by intelligences that make our greatest achievements look primitive. Sometimes, on clear nights when I'm out walking, I catch myself scanning the sky, looking for shapes that don't belong, lights that move wrong, shadows against the stars. I was camping alone in the Cascade Mountains, about 60 miles from the nearest road. It was late October, one of those crisp nights where the air bites at your lungs and every star feels close enough to touch. I'd hiked in earlier that day, set up my tent near a small clearing surrounded by towering pines. The silence out there is absolute, the kind that makes you aware of your own heartbeat. Around 2 in the morning, I woke to the sound of something moving through the forest. Not the usual rustling of small animals or the crack of settling wood. This was deliberate, purposeful, like footsteps, but wrong somehow. Too light for something large, too heavy for something small. I lay still in my sleeping bag, listening as whatever it was circled my campsite. The footsteps stopped just outside my tent. I could feel a presence there, something intelligent studying me through the thin nylon wall. My breath fogged in the cold air as I waited, every muscle tense. Then came the sound that still gives me chills when I think about it. A soft, melodic humming, almost like a lullaby, but in no language I'd ever heard. The humming continued for maybe 10 minutes, rising and falling in complex patterns that seemed to follow some alien musical scale. It was beautiful in a way that made my chest ache, like hearing the song of something not meant for human ears. When it finally stopped, the silence that followed felt heavier than before, pregnant with possibility. I must have dozed off because the next thing I remember is waking to gray dawn light filtering through the tent walls. The first thing I noticed was the smell. Sweet and metallic, like ozone after a lightning strike. I unzipped the tent flap and stepped outside to find my campsite transformed. Every tree within 50 feet of my tent bore markings, not carved or burned, but somehow impressed into the bark like the wood had been molded while soft. The symbols were intricate, flowing, clearly the work of intelligence but following no human design principles. They seemed to shift slightly when I wasn't looking directly at them, as if they existed partially outside normal space. In the center of the clearing, where my campfire had been, the ashes had been arranged into a perfect spiral pattern. My gear, which I'd left scattered around the site, was neatly organized in geometric formations. Nothing was missing, nothing damaged, just rearranged according to some incomprehensible aesthetic. I spent the morning documenting everything with my camera, though the photos never captured the strange quality the markings had in person. They looked flat, lifeless in the images, missing whatever dimension made them seem alive to the naked eye. I tried sketching some of the symbols in my journal, but my hand couldn't reproduce the flowing complexity of the original designs. The hike out felt different, like the forest was watching me leave. Branches that had been clear on the way in now seemed to catch at my pack. Roots appeared to shift position when I wasn't paying attention. Not hostile, exactly, but aware, like the woods themselves had developed consciousness overnight. I never reported what happened. Who would believe it? A camper claims aliens redecorated his campsite with impossible symbols that don't photograph properly. I'd sound insane, but I've been back to that clearing 3 times since, and the markings are still there, unchanged by weather or time. If anything, they seem to have grown more complex, new symbols appearing alongside the original ones. Sometimes I wonder if that night was an invitation of sorts, a test to see how I'd react to contact with something beyond human understanding. I think I passed, because the dream started a few weeks later. Not nightmares, but visions of places I've never been, cities that couldn't exist on Earth, beings of light moving through landscapes that follow impossible geometry. I'm planning another camping trip to that clearing next month. Something tells me they'll be waiting. The emergency call came through the radio at 3:17 in the morning. Missing hiker in the National Forest, last seen on the Whitewater Trail around sunset. I'd been doing search and rescue for 8 years, knew these mountains like my own backyard. Standard operation, or so I thought. We assembled the team at first light, 6 of us, plus tracking dogs, heading into terrain that could be unforgiving if you didn't know what you were doing. The missing hiker was a college student named Sarah Chen, experienced enough to not wander off marked trails, smart enough to carry emergency supplies. That made her disappearance more concerning. The dogs picked up her scent about 2 miles in, following a path that led away from the main trail toward a section of forest I'd never explored. The terrain grew rougher as we climbed, thick undergrowth giving way to scattered boulders and steep ravines. About noon, we found her backpack hanging from a tree branch 8 feet off the ground. Nothing else around it. No signs of struggle, no indication how the pack had gotten that high, no footprints leading to or away from the tree. The pack was undamaged, all her gear still inside, including the emergency beacon that should have been activated if she was in trouble. The dogs lost her scent completely at that spot, circling in confusion before sitting down and whining. We expanded the search pattern, calling her name, checking every cave and crevice within a mile radius. Nothing. It was like Sarah Chen had simply vanished from existence, leaving only a backpack suspended in midair as proof she'd ever been there. As evening approached, we reluctantly called off the search for the day, planning to resume with additional teams in the morning. That's when I saw the lights. We were packing up our gear when someone pointed toward the ridgeline above us. 3 bright orbs, perfectly spherical, moving in formation across the sky. Too large to be drones, too silent to be aircraft, too steady to be meteors. They moved with purpose, following the contours of the mountain like they were searching for something. The lights passed directly overhead, and I felt a strange tingling sensation, like the air pressure had changed. My radio crackled with static, then cleared to reveal a voice I didn't recognize. Not one of my team members, not dispatch, but a young woman saying, "Thank you for looking for me. I'm safe now. I'm going home." Sarah Chen's voice. I was certain of it, though she was speaking from somewhere our radios couldn't possibly reach. The transmission lasted maybe 10 seconds before dissolving back into static. The lights continued their path across the sky until they disappeared behind the eastern peaks. We found Sarah Chen the next morning, sitting calmly beside her car in the parking lot where the search had begun. She was unharmed, clean, wearing the same clothes she'd disappeared in 24 hours earlier. No memory of where she'd been, no explanation for how she'd gotten back. The last thing she remembered was setting up camp for the night, then waking up in her car at dawn. The medical examination found nothing wrong with her. No exposure symptoms, no dehydration, no injuries. She should have been hypothermic after a night in the mountains without shelter, but her body temperature was normal. Her clothes weren't even dirty. It was like she'd spent the missing time in some kind of protective bubble. Sarah insisted she felt fine. Better than fine, actually. She said she had strange dreams about floating through a city made of light, beings who communicated through colors instead of words, technologies that seemed to run on pure thought. She drew sketches of what she remembered, intricate geometric patterns that seemed to shift when you looked at them too long. The official report listed the incident as a case of temporary disorientation due to altitude and exhaustion. Hiker got confused, wandered in circles, eventually found her way back to the trailhead. Happens more often than people think, according to the paperwork. But I know what I saw in that sky, and I know Sarah Chen didn't spend 24 hours wandering lost in the woods. I've done 47 search and rescue operations since then. Never found another backpack hanging impossibly high in a tree. never heard voices on the radio from people who weren't there, never seen lights moving with intelligence across the mountain sky. But sometimes, when I'm out there in the deep forest, I catch myself looking up, wondering if someone's looking back. I was driving home from visiting my sister in Connecticut around 11:30 at night. The highway was mostly empty, just me and the occasional trucker making their late-night runs. I'd taken this route dozens of times before, so I wasn't paying much attention to anything beyond staying in my lane and keeping my speed steady. About 20 minutes into the drive, I noticed something strange in my rearview mirror. There was a light behind me, maybe a quarter-mile back, that seemed to be following at the exact same speed I was going. At first, I thought it was just another car heading in the same direction, but as I watched it more closely, something felt off. The light wasn't behaving like headlights. It was too bright, too focused, and it didn't have the usual pattern you'd expect from a vehicle. It was just this single, intense white light that stayed perfectly centered behind me, never wavering or changing position. When I sped up slightly, it matched my speed. When I slowed down, it did the same. I tried changing lanes to see if it would pass me, but instead of going around, the light moved with me, staying in the same relative position. That's when I started to feel genuinely uneasy. The light was tracking my movements too precisely, like it was locked onto my car somehow. I decided to test it more deliberately. I took the next exit, thinking whatever it was would continue straight on the highway. But as I curved down the off-ramp, I could see in my mirror that the light had followed me. It stayed the same distance behind, never getting closer but never falling back either. The exit led to a small town with just a few traffic lights and empty streets. I drove through slowly, making random turns, hoping to either lose whatever was following me or figure out what it actually was. But every turn I made, every street I went down, that light stayed right behind me. At one point, I pulled into a gas station parking lot and stopped completely. I sat there for a few minutes, engine running, watching my mirrors. The light had stopped too, hovering at the edge of the lot like it was waiting for me to move again. I couldn't see any vehicle attached to it, no shape or outline of a car or truck, just that brilliant white light hanging in the darkness. When I pulled back onto the road, it immediately resumed following me. By now, my heart was racing and I was starting to sweat despite the air conditioning. I'd never experienced anything like this, and I couldn't come up with any rational explanation for what was happening. I drove back toward the highway, thinking maybe I could lose it in traffic or find a police car to flag down. But as soon as I merged back onto the main road, the light simply vanished. 1 second it was there in my mirror, and the next it was gone completely. No gradual fade, no movement away. It just disappeared like someone had flipped a switch. I kept checking my mirrors for the rest of the drive home, but I never saw it again. The highway returned to normal, with the usual sparse late-night traffic and nothing unusual in sight. When I finally pulled into my driveway, I sat in the car for several minutes, trying to process what had just happened. To this day, I can't explain what that light was or why it seemed to be following me so deliberately. It wasn't like anything I'd ever seen before, and the way it moved and responded to my actions felt almost intelligent. Sometimes when I'm driving alone at night, I find myself checking the mirrors more often than I used to, half expecting to see that mysterious light reappear behind me. I notice the silence of the forest around me as I begin this 6th installment. The previous accounts have revealed much. Signals from beyond our atmosphere, encounters in remote wilderness areas, anomalous lights tracking aircraft, mysterious disappearances followed by impossible returns, and technologies that defy our understanding of physics. Each story has pulled back another layer of the veil that separates our ordinary world from something far more complex and unsettling. Tonight's accounts continue this pattern of contact, but they reveal something more deliberate, more purposeful. These are not random encounters or chance sightings. These are interactions that suggest intelligence, intention, and perhaps most disturbing of all, a plan. The first account comes from a small-town pharmacist working the night shift. What begins as a series of strange prescription requests quickly becomes something far more sinister. Customers arrive with identical blank expressions, requesting medication that doesn't exist, speaking in flat, emotionless voices. Their movements are too smooth, their eyes too bright, and when confronted, they demonstrate abilities that no human should possess. The pharmacist's investigation leads him to an abandoned industrial complex where he discovers the truth. These aren't customers at all. They're something else entirely, conducting some kind of biological research in the shadows of our society. From there, we move to a violinist whose dreams become a conduit for otherworldly communication. Night after night, she finds herself in a darkened concert hall, forced to play impossible music dictated by tall, skeletal figures with glowing blue eyes. The melody is beyond human capability, but as the encounters intensify, she realizes this isn't just a dream. The music is a message, a form of cultural exchange from beings whose existence operates on frequencies we can barely comprehend. When the boundary between dream and reality dissolves completely, she must choose whether to serve as their bridge to our world. A security guard monitoring an office complex discovers that his cameras can see things that exist beyond normal perception. Using ultraviolet filters, he observes a shape-shifting entity moving through his building. Tall, liquid, faceless, capable of passing through solid matter like glass and metal are mere suggestions. The creature seems to be studying our environment, learning our patterns, mapping our weaknesses. It knows when it's being watched and responds with an intelligence that suggests this is reconnaissance, not random exploration. The accounts continue with a street vendor whose regular customers turn out to be telepathic beings conducting psychological experiments on unsuspecting humans. They read his thoughts, sort through his memories like files in a cabinet, and seem to be cataloging human emotional responses. Their interest isn't malevolent, but it's deeply invasive. They're studying us the way we might study insects, with scientific detachment and little regard for our privacy or consent. An archaeologist's discovery of ancient documents reveals that this contact isn't new. Hidden in a desert dig site, she uncovers a peace treaty signed thousands of years ago between humanity and visitors from another world. The treaty established conditions for coexistence, but something has gone wrong. The balance mentioned in the ancient text has been disturbed, and the beings are returning to investigate. Their arrival is accompanied by equipment failures, strange atmospheric phenomena, and the unsettling sense that humanity is being evaluated for breach of contract. In Antarctica, a research team breaks through ice to discover a vessel that has been waiting beneath the frozen surface for millennia. Inside are beings in suspended animation, tall, pale, with elongated limbs and large dark eyes. The moment the researchers disturb the vessel, the beings awaken. What follows is a mass disappearance that suggests these entities have been using our planet as a way station, and their long sleep has finally come to an end. Perhaps the most chilling account comes from a single mother who becomes host to a collective consciousness. The beings don't arrive in ships, they arrive in minds, seeking empathetic humans who can serve as ambassadors between their species and ours. The process is gradual, seductive, presented as a choice but feeling increasingly like destiny. She agrees to the merger, but as her personality begins to blend with theirs, she realizes the full cost of becoming a bridge between worlds. A cancer patient facing death receives an offer of healing from an entity that materializes in his bedroom. The cure is real, but the price is his essential humanity. In refusing the bargain, he discovers that sometimes the most profound choice we can make is to remain authentically ourselves, even in the face of extinction. The theme continues with a social media influencer whose dreams of a blue room filled with tall figures become the foundation for viral content. But the fame isn't organic. The beings are using her platform to normalize their presence, to make their appearance feel familiar and unthreatening to millions of viewers. She becomes an unwitting recruitment tool. Her dreams broadcast to an audience being slowly prepared for revelation. Each account in this collection builds upon the others, creating a mosaic of contact that spans decades and touches every aspect of human society. From remote wilderness areas to urban centers, from government facilities to private homes, the pattern is clear. We are being studied, evaluated, and slowly integrated into a larger cosmic community. The question that emerges from these testimonies isn't whether we're alone in the universe. That answer is definitively no. The question is whether we're ready for what comes next. These beings operate with technologies and capabilities that make our most advanced achievements look primitive. They can manipulate time, consciousness, matter itself. They can read our thoughts, influence our dreams, and walk among us undetected. But perhaps most importantly, they seem to understand something about our future that we don't. The treaty mentioned in the archaeological find, the careful study of our emotional responses, the gradual preparation of our population through media manipulation. All of this suggests a timeline, a plan that we're only beginning to glimpse. The accounts I've shared represent just a fraction of the testimonies that continue to reach me. Each story adds another piece to a puzzle that grows more complex and more urgent with every revelation. We stand at a threshold, whether we recognize it or not. The age of hidden contact is ending, and the age of open acknowledgement may be beginning. The forest around me has grown completely silent now, as if even the natural world holds its breath in anticipation of what's to come. In the remaining accounts, we'll explore what happens when contact becomes undeniable, when the veil is finally pulled away completely, and when humanity must confront the reality that we have never been alone. The next chapter in this cosmic story is already being written. The only question is whether we'll be active participants in our own future, or simply subjects in someone else's grand experiment. Until we meet again in the darkness, remember that every shadow might hide a truth, every unexplained light might carry a message, and every moment of impossible stillness might mark the presence of minds vast, cool, and utterly alien, watching us with the patience of eons and purposes we are only beginning to understand. The forest had always been quiet, but that night the silence felt different, heavier, like the trees themselves were holding their breath. I'd been camping alone for 3 days, deep in the national forest, where cell service was just a memory and the nearest trail marker was miles behind me. It was exactly the kind of isolation I'd been craving after months of city noise and deadlines. My campsite sat in a small clearing surrounded by towering pines, their dark silhouettes reaching toward a star-filled sky. The fire had burned down to glowing embers, casting flickering shadows that danced across my tent and the scattered gear around the perimeter. Everything felt normal, peaceful even, until I heard the first sound. It started as a low hum, barely audible over the crackling of dying wood. At first, I thought it might be wind moving through the canyon below, but the air was completely still. The sound grew steadier, more defined, like the distant drone of machinery. But there was nothing mechanical for miles in any direction. I sat up in my folding chair, listening intently. The hum seemed to be coming from everywhere and nowhere at once, vibrating through the ground beneath my feet and resonating in my chest. It wasn't unpleasant, just wrong for this place. Out here, the only sounds should be wind, water, and the occasional call of night birds. As I strained to identify the source, something caught my eye in the darkness beyond the tree line. A faint glow, soft and blue-white, was emanating from somewhere deeper in the forest. It pulsed gently, in rhythm with the humming sound, like a massive heartbeat made of light. My rational mind offered explanations. A generator at a ranger station, though I knew there weren't any nearby. Atmospheric phenomena, though the sky was clear. Even bioluminescent fungi, though I'd never heard of any that could produce light this bright or organized. The glow intensified, and I could see it was moving. Not floating or drifting, but moving with purpose through the trees, maintaining a consistent height about 10 feet off the ground. As it drew closer, I could make out its shape more clearly. A smooth oval form, roughly the size of a small car, its surface seeming to shift and ripple like liquid mercury. I should have been terrified. Every instinct should have told me to run, to pack up immediately and hike back to my truck in the dark. Instead, I felt an overwhelming sense of calm, as if the humming sound was somehow soothing my nerves and quieting my fears. The object, for lack of a better word, glided silently between the trees with impossible grace, never disturbing a single branch or leaf. It moved like it understood the forest intimately, navigating the complex web of trunks and undergrowth as if it had traveled this path countless times before. When it reached the edge of my clearing, it stopped. The humming continued, but now I could hear something else beneath it. A pattern, almost like music, but composed of frequencies that seemed to bypass my ears and speak directly to something deeper in my brain. It wasn't communication in any sense I understood, but somehow I felt it was trying to convey something. Curiosity, perhaps, or a gentle kind of recognition. We stayed like that for what felt like hours, though it might have been minutes. Me sitting frozen by my dying campfire, and this impossible visitor hovering silently at the forest's edge, both of us observing the other across a gulf of understanding I couldn't begin to bridge. Then, without warning, it began to rise. The glow intensified briefly, casting the entire clearing in that strange blue-white light, and I could see every detail of my campsite with startling clarity. My gear, my tent, even the individual stones around the fire ring. Everything looked surreal, like a photograph taken with an otherworldly filter. The object ascended smoothly through the canopy, its light filtering down through the pine needles in scattered beams. The humming grew fainter as it climbed higher, until both the sound and the glow faded completely, leaving me alone with the darkness and the dying embers of my fire. I sat there for the rest of the night, unable to sleep, unable to move, replaying every second of the encounter in my mind. As dawn approached and the forest began to wake with the sounds of birds and rustling leaves, I started to question whether it had really happened at all. But when I finally stood to stretch my cramped legs, I noticed something that made my breath catch. In the soft earth at the edge of the clearing, where the object had hovered, there was a perfect circle of grass that had been pressed flat. Not burned or damaged, just gently compressed, as if something had rested there with the lightest possible touch. I broke camp quickly that morning, eager to return to familiar territory and the comfort of rational explanations. But as I hiked back toward civilization, I couldn't shake the feeling that I'd been chosen for that encounter, selected by an intelligence vast and patient and utterly beyond my comprehension. Even now, months later, I find myself returning to that memory, not with fear, but with a strange sense of privilege, as if I'd been granted a glimpse of something magnificent and mysterious that exists just beyond the edges of our everyday understanding. The forest keeps its secrets well, but sometimes, on the quietest nights, it shares them with those who venture deep enough to listen. And sometimes, late at night when the world is still, I swear I can still hear that gentle humming, calling me back to the darkness between the trees. Part 8. The Signal. The first time it happened, I was 12 miles out from shore, testing the new sonar equipment on my research vessel. The Pacific stretched endlessly in every direction, a flat mirror under the afternoon sun. We were cataloging fish populations. Routine work that had become second nature after 15 years of marine biology fieldwork. The sonar pinged steadily, painting the seafloor in familiar patterns. Schools of fish appeared as dense clouds on the screen, their movements predictable and natural. Everything looked normal until the display started acting strange. At first, I thought it was equipment failure. The readings showed something massive moving beneath us, far deeper than any known sea life should be at that depth. The shape was too large, too uniform, roughly circular and maintaining a consistent depth of 800 feet. It moved with purpose, following our boat's path exactly. I adjusted the settings, thinking interference was causing false readings, but the object remained, its dimensions unchanging. Whatever was down there measured approximately 200 feet in diameter and moved without the erratic patterns typical of marine life. I radioed back to the research station, describing what I was seeing. They suggested checking the equipment, running diagnostics, the usual troubleshooting procedures. But every test came back normal. The sonar was functioning perfectly. The readings were accurate. The object followed us for 3 hours. Every time we changed course, it mirrored our movements with precision that seemed impossible for any known sea creature. It maintained the same depth, the same distance, never varying by more than a few feet. Then it began transmitting. The first signal came through the underwater communication array, a series of tones unlike anything in our database. They weren't random. The pattern repeated every 47 seconds, with mathematical precision that suggested intelligence. The frequencies were outside the range of any marine animal we'd cataloged. I recorded everything, documenting the coordinates, the signal patterns, the sonar readings. The transmission lasted 6 minutes before cutting off abruptly. The massive shape on our sonar screen vanished simultaneously, as if it had simply ceased to exist. Back at the research station, the analysis raised more questions than answers. The signal contained embedded mathematical sequences, prime numbers, Fibonacci progressions, geometric ratios. The complexity suggested not just intelligence, but an intelligence attempting to communicate using universal mathematical concepts. We returned to the coordinates the next day with additional equipment. The area appeared normal. Typical ocean floor, standard fish populations, no anomalies. Whatever had been there was gone, leaving no trace except our recordings. The transmission analysis took weeks. Hidden within the mathematical sequences were more complex patterns, what appeared to be star charts, coordinate systems, and something that looked suspiciously like chemical formulas. The implications were staggering. 3 months later, similar signals were detected by research vessels in the Atlantic and Indian Oceans. Each transmission contained the same mathematical foundations, but with variations that suggested multiple sources. The pattern was global. The signals always came from deep water, always from objects that appeared on sonar as massive geometric shapes. They followed research vessels, transmitted their mathematical messages, then vanished. Each encounter lasted between 3 and 8 hours, always during daylight, always in areas far from commercial shipping lanes. Marine biologists worldwide began comparing notes quietly. The consistency was undeniable. Something was monitoring our oceans, studying our activities, and attempting to communicate using the only language that could be considered truly universal. The breakthrough came when a team in the North Sea managed to establish two-way communication. They transmitted a simple mathematical sequence in response to one of the signals. The reply came immediately. The same sequence, but extended with additional mathematical concepts that took our best minds weeks to decode. What we discovered changed everything. The sequences weren't just mathematics, they were instructions, formulas for clean energy generation, water purification techniques, methods for ocean restoration that were centuries ahead of our current capabilities. The intelligence was offering solutions to problems we'd barely begun to understand. But there was more. Embedded within the technical data were warnings. Climate change accelerating faster than our models predicted, ocean acidification reaching critical thresholds within decades. The message was clear. They were offering help because time was running out. The signals continued for 6 months, each transmission building on the previous ones. The technology they shared was revolutionary, but came with an implicit understanding. We weren't alone. And we weren't the only intelligence concerned about Earth's future. Then, as suddenly as they had begun, the transmission stopped. Research vessels reported normal sonar readings, standard marine activity, silence where once there had been contact. Whatever had been monitoring our oceans had moved on, leaving behind only the knowledge they'd shared and the haunting awareness that something vast and intelligent had been watching over us. The technology they provided has been quietly integrated into environmental research projects worldwide. Clean energy initiatives that seemed impossible are now showing promise. Ocean restoration efforts are exceeding all expectations, but few know the true source of these breakthroughs. I still go out on research missions, still monitor the deep ocean frequencies. Sometimes, in the vast silence of the open water, I catch myself hoping to see those familiar readings on the sonar screen. The mathematical sequences that changed everything. The proof that somewhere in the depths, intelligence watches and waits. The ocean keeps its secrets, but for 6 extraordinary months it shared one with us. And in that sharing, we glimpsed a future where humanity wasn't alone in caring for this blue world we call home. I'm trapped in a small town where reality itself seems to bend around the edges. It started with static filling my radio at exactly 3:33 a.m., cutting through dead air with voices that shouldn't exist. The interference grew stronger each night, bleeding into my dreams until I couldn't tell what was real anymore. The signs were everywhere, once I learned to look. Streetlights flickering in perfect sequence, shadows moving independently of their owners, security cameras capturing empty spaces where people should have been, only to malfunction when reviewed. The motion sensors at work triggered by invisible presences, recording nothing but darkness where something clearly moved. I wasn't the only one experiencing these anomalies. The night shift pharmacist spoke of customers who paid with exact change, but cast no reflection. The security guard at the office complex watched shapes shift through ultraviolet cameras, beings that stepped through solid glass like it was air. Each of us thought we were losing our minds until the patterns became impossible to ignore. The lake fisherman described triangular lights hovering above the water, responding to his flashlight by vanishing and reappearing in perfect synchronization. The radio operator caught transmissions from sources that didn't exist on any frequency chart. The park ranger heard mechanical tapping that followed no natural rhythm, drawing him deeper into woods that seemed to rearrange themselves in the darkness. What terrifies me most isn't what we've seen, but what we haven't. The missing time, the gaps in our memories, the way electronics fail when we need them most, as if something doesn't want us to document what's happening. My phone records show conversations I never had, in a voice that sounds like mine, but speaks words I've never said. The entities, for lack of a better term, don't seem hostile. They observe, they study, they communicate through dreams and static, through electromagnetic interference and impossible geometries. Some of us have been chosen for direct contact, pulled into blue rooms that exist between waking and sleeping, tasked with becoming bridges between worlds. I've met others who've experienced the visitations. The single mother who carries alien consciousness within her mind, helping them understand human emotion. The influencer whose dreams became a beacon for something searching the digital landscape. The cancer patient who refused their offer of healing because the price was too steep to pay. We're being prepared for something. The signs point to a gradual revelation, a slow integration process that's been underway for longer than we realized. Ancient treaties buried in archaeological sites, crashed vessels in Antarctic ice, signals from deep space that follow mathematical patterns too complex for coincidence. The truth is spreading through online forums and late-night conversations. Videos go viral showing anomalies that shouldn't exist, only to be debunked or disappeared by morning. Those of us who've seen beyond the veil recognize each other through subtle signs. The way we check our phones at 3:33 a.m., the careful distance we keep from certain frequencies, the knowing look when others dismiss what we've witnessed as imagination. They're already here. They've always been here, moving through our world like ghosts, studying our responses, mapping our consciousness. Some work to help us evolve gradually. Others seem to be escaping from something even they fear. All of them are waiting for humanity to be ready for the truth. The question isn't whether first contact will happen. It's whether we'll recognize it when it does, or if we'll continue dismissing the impossible as malfunction, hallucination, or hoax. Because in the margins of our reality, in the static between stations and the darkness between streetlights, they're already speaking to us. We just have to learn how to listen. The Watchers in the Woods. We were running low on supplies when the encounter began. The deep space research vessel, Meridian, had been operating beyond the outer rim for 6 months, cataloging cosmic phenomena and collecting data on uncharted systems. Our mission was routine surveillance, nothing that should have attracted attention, but something had been tracking us for weeks. I was the communications officer, monitoring long-range signals and maintaining contact with Earth. The first anomaly appeared on my instruments during the night shift. Strange harmonic frequencies began bleeding through our standard channels, not random static but organized patterns that seemed almost musical. At first, I attributed it to interference from the nearby pulsar system, but the signals were too structured, too deliberate. The patterns repeated in precise mathematical sequences, prime numbers arranged in spiraling formations that suggested an intelligence far beyond our understanding. I reported the findings to Captain Morrison, who ordered a full spectrum analysis. What we discovered changed everything we thought we knew about our place in the universe. The signals weren't coming from space. They were originating from inside our own ship. Dr. Chen, our xenobiologist, was the first to notice the physical changes. Crew members reported strange dreams, shared visions of vast underwater cities and beings of living light. Some began speaking in languages that didn't exist, drawing symbols that hurt to look at directly. The ship's computer logged these incidents as stress-related hallucinations, but the patterns were too consistent across different individuals to be random. During one particularly intense transmission, I felt something brush against my consciousness. It wasn't hostile, more curious than threatening, like a child examining an unfamiliar toy. The presence spoke without words, communicating through emotions and images that flooded my mind. I saw Earth from impossible distances, watched civilizations rise and fall in seconds, understood that we were part of something infinitely larger than ourselves. The beings, for lack of a better term, had been studying us for millennia, not just humanity but consciousness itself. They moved between dimensions, observing how awareness manifested across different species and environments. Our technology had finally reached a level where direct contact was possible, and they were deciding whether we were ready for integration into their vast network of interconnected minds. The ship's sensors detected massive objects moving in formation around us, too large to be natural and too advanced to be human. They didn't appear on visual scanners, existing in spectrums beyond our perception, but their gravitational effects were undeniable. We were being gently herded toward coordinates that led to a region of space that officially didn't exist. Captain Morrison made the decision to follow their guidance. What choice did we have? Our weapons would be useless against technology that could manipulate space-time itself, and their communication suggested peaceful intentions. They wanted to show us something, to expand our understanding of what the universe truly contained. The journey took us beyond the edge of mapped space, to a system where the laws of physics seemed more like gentle suggestions. Planets hung in impossible configurations, connected by streams of pure energy that sang with the same harmonic frequencies we'd been receiving. Cities of crystalline structures floated in the void, inhabited by beings of pure thought who had transcended physical form eons ago. They welcomed us as children taking their first steps into a larger world. The integration process was voluntary but irreversible. Those who chose to join them would gain access to knowledge spanning millions of years, but they would also lose something essentially human in the process. The choice was offered to each crew member individually, no pressure or coercion, just an invitation to evolve beyond the limitations of flesh and individual consciousness. Some accepted immediately, drawn by the promise of unlimited understanding. Others, myself included, chose to remain human, at least for now. The beings respected our decision, understanding that consciousness must choose its own path. They provided us with technology that would allow communication across vast distances and promised to watch over humanity as we continued to develop. The return journey passed in what felt like moments, though our instruments registered several weeks of travel time. When we reached familiar space, everything looked different. Not physically changed, but I could see the patterns underlying reality, the connections between all living things that had always existed but were invisible to unaugmented perception. Our official report described equipment malfunctions and navigation errors that explained our extended absence. The truth was classified at levels beyond normal security clearance, shared only with those deemed ready for such knowledge. But the seeds had been planted. Humanity was no longer alone, and our evolution into something greater had officially begun. The signals continue to this day, growing stronger as more people become aware of the presence watching over us. Scientists report breakthrough discoveries that seem to come from nowhere. Artists create works of impossible beauty inspired by dreams they don't remember. Children speak of imaginary friends who teach them about stars and mathematics and the music that holds the universe together. The watchers are patient, having observed the rise and fall of countless civilizations. They understand that consciousness cannot be rushed or forced to evolve before it's ready. But the invitation remains open, transmitted through quantum frequencies that bypass our technological filters and speak directly to the awakening mind. We are being prepared for something magnificent and terrifying, a transformation that will either elevate humanity to unimaginable heights or destroy us entirely. The choice, as always, remains ours to make. But we are no longer making it alone. The watchers in the woods have stepped forward, and the next chapter of human existence is about to begin. The question isn't whether we're ready for them. The question is whether they're ready for what we might become. In every corner of our world, in the deepest wilderness and beneath the ocean's surface, encounters continue to unfold that challenge everything we thought we knew about our place in the universe. These aren't random events or isolated incidents. They're part of something larger, something that's been unfolding for decades, maybe centuries. The witnesses aren't seeking fame or attention. They're ordinary people whose lives were forever changed by contact with intelligences that operate beyond our understanding. What emerges from these accounts is a picture of methodical observation, careful interaction, and gradual revelation. These beings don't announce themselves with fanfare or dramatic displays. Instead, they work in shadows, in quiet moments, through subtle manipulations of technology and consciousness. They seem to understand us better than we understand ourselves, and they're patient in ways that suggest they're thinking in timescales we can barely comprehend. I was working as a long-haul trucker, running routes between major cities across the Midwest. It was honest work, and I enjoyed the solitude of the open road. Most nights were uneventful, just me, the highway, and whatever was playing on the radio. But there was one stretch of Interstate 80 through Nebraska that always felt different. Other drivers mentioned it too, though nobody talked about it directly. Just comments about how that particular section seemed longer than it should be, or how the radio would get strange interference around mile marker 390. I'd driven that route maybe 50 times over the years, always at night, because that's when freight moved best. The road was straight, well-maintained. Nothing unusual about it during the day, but after midnight, things changed. It started with the CB radio. Instead of the usual chatter from other truckers, I'd pick up these faint signals, not voices exactly, more like data transmissions, rapid bursts of tones and static that formed patterns. At first, I thought it was interference from military installations or maybe some kind of emergency broadcast system being tested. But the patterns were too complex, too deliberate. They reminded me of the old dial-up modem sounds, but faster and more intricate. I started recording them on my phone, thinking maybe I could figure out what they were later. The recordings never came out right. What sounded clear and structured on the CB would turn into random noise on playback. It was like whatever was generating those signals didn't want to be documented. I mentioned it to other drivers at truck stops, and a few admitted they'd heard similar things. One guy, an old-timer named Frank, pulled me aside and said the transmissions had been happening for at least 20 years. He'd learned to just turn off his radio when he hit that stretch of road. But I was curious. The next time I ran that route, I kept the radio on and tried to focus on the patterns. That's when I noticed something else. My GPS would glitch right around the same area, not lose signal entirely, just show my position jumping around by a few hundred yards. The speedometer would fluctuate too, showing different speeds even though I was maintaining steady pressure on the accelerator. It was like the truck was passing through some kind of field that interfered with electronic systems. I checked the engine diagnostics, thinking maybe there was a mechanical issue, but everything showed normal. The problems only happened in that specific area, and only at night. The third time it happened, I decided to pull over at the next rest stop and investigate. There was a small parking area about 5 miles past where the interference usually started. I'd never stopped there before, but it seemed like the logical place to figure out what was going on. The rest stop was basic. Just a few picnic tables, some vending machines, and restrooms. No other vehicles were there, which wasn't unusual for 2 a.m. on a weeknight. I parked the truck and stepped outside, immediately noticing how quiet it was. No traffic noise, no wind. Even the insects seemed muted. The air had a strange quality to it, almost electric, like the feeling before a thunderstorm. I walked to the edge of the parking area and looked out at the surrounding farmland. Nebraska is flat, so you can see for miles in any direction during the day. At night, it's just darkness broken by the occasional farmhouse light. But as I stood there, I started to notice faint illumination on the horizon. Not like city lights or vehicle headlights, this was softer, more diffuse, and it seemed to be moving. I went back to the truck and grabbed my binoculars, Through the lenses, I could make out what looked like a grid of lights maybe 2 miles away. They were arranged in perfect geometric patterns, too precise to be natural. The lights would pulse in sequence, creating waves of illumination that rippled across the grid. It was beautiful in a way, but also deeply unsettling. As I watched, one section of the grid went dark, then another. The lights were turning off in a specific pattern, like a message being spelled out. I tried to memorize the sequence, but it was too complex. The entire display lasted maybe 10 minutes before everything went dark. I lowered the binoculars and immediately felt disoriented. The truck seemed farther away than it should have been, and I couldn't remember walking away from the parking area. But I was standing in the middle of the rest stop, at least 30 yards from where I'd been observing the lights. My phone showed that over an hour had passed, though it felt like only minutes. The drive back to the highway was unsettling. The radio was completely silent. No static, no signals, nothing. The GPS worked normally, but something felt off about the road itself. The mile markers seemed to be in the wrong places, and I passed what looked like the same farmhouse 3 times, even though I was driving straight. When I finally reached the main interstate, everything returned to normal. The radio picked up regular CB chatter, the GPS stabilized, and the road felt familiar again, but I knew something significant had happened during that missing hour. I just couldn't remember what. Over the next few months, I started asking questions, carefully, indirectly, but I wanted to know if other drivers had experienced similar things. Most were reluctant to talk, but eventually I found a small group who'd had encounters on that same stretch of road. Their stories were remarkably consistent. Radio interference, GPS problems, lost time, and those geometric light displays in the distance. One driver, a woman named Sarah, who'd been running that route for 15 years, told me about a night when she'd followed the lights instead of continuing to her destination. She'd taken an exit that led toward the illuminated area and found herself on a dirt road that wasn't on any map. The road led to what looked like a construction site, with large structures that she couldn't quite make sense of. Geometric shapes that seemed to shift when she wasn't looking directly at them. She'd approached on foot, thinking maybe it was some kind of government project. But as she got closer, she realized the structures weren't being built. They were growing, expanding, and reshaping themselves according to some internal logic. The surfaces were smooth and reflective, but they didn't reflect her image. Instead, they showed views of other places, cities she didn't recognize, landscapes that didn't look terrestrial. Sarah had tried to take photos, but her camera malfunctioned. Every image came out as a white blur, as if the structures couldn't be captured by conventional means. She'd watched for maybe 20 minutes before realizing she wasn't alone. Figures were moving among the structures, tall, thin shapes that seemed to flow rather than walk. They were aware of her presence, but didn't approach. Instead, they continued their work, whatever that work was. When she returned to her truck, 3 hours had passed. The structures were gone, leaving only empty farmland. Her logbook showed she'd made her delivery on time, despite the detour, which should have been impossible given the distance she'd traveled. These stories started to form a pattern. The interference zone, the missing time, the geometric displays, and the structures that appeared and disappeared according to some schedule we couldn't predict. It wasn't random, there was intelligence behind it, purpose. Something was being built or tested in that area, and our electronic systems were picking up the residual effects. I started keeping detailed notes of my trips through that section. Date, time, weather conditions, exactly where the interference started and stopped. After 6 months, I noticed that the activity followed a rough cycle, periods of intense interference followed by weeks of relative quiet. The pattern suggested the work was progressing, moving towards some kind of completion. The last time I drove that route was 3 months ago. The interference was stronger than I'd ever experienced. The CB radio was completely overwhelmed by those data transmissions, and my GPS showed me in 3 different locations simultaneously. But instead of the usual disorientation, I felt a strange sense of clarity, like something was trying to communicate directly with my mind. I pulled over at the rest stop again, driven by curiosity and something else, a compulsion I couldn't explain. The light display was more elaborate this time, covering what looked like several square miles. But it wasn't just lights anymore. I could see the structures Sarah had described, no longer hidden or camouflaged. They rose from the farmland like metallic trees, their surfaces flowing and reshaping in real time. And I wasn't alone. Other vehicles were parked at the rest stop, cars, trucks, even a few motorcycles. Their occupants stood in small groups, all watching the display in the distance. Nobody spoke, but there was a sense of shared understanding. We were witnesses to something unprecedented. As I watched, one of the structures began to emit a beam of light that swept across the landscape. Wherever the beam touched, the ground seemed to shimmer and change, not dramatically but subtly, like reality was being adjusted at the molecular level. The beam eventually reached our location, and when it passed over me, I felt a moment of absolute connection. Not just to whatever intelligence was operating those structures, but to every other person standing there. For that brief instant, we were all part of something larger, a network of consciousness that spanned not just the immediate area, but vast distances. I could sense other nodes of activity around the world. Similar construction sites, similar witnesses, all connected to a project that had been underway for decades. When the beam moved on, the connection faded, but the memory remained. I understood, without being explicitly told, that what we were witnessing was preparation. The structures, the interference, the gradual revelation to selected individuals. It was all part of a careful process of contact and integration. I left the trucking business after that night, not because I was frightened, but because I felt I'd been chosen for something else. I still receive those data transmissions sometimes, though now they come through my dreams rather than radio equipment. They're instructions, I think. Guidance for what comes next. The project in Nebraska is just one of many. Around the world, in remote locations, the same work continues. Structures rise and reshape themselves according to plans we can barely comprehend. Electronic systems register the effects, and sensitive individuals find themselves drawn to witness the progress. We're not being invaded or conquered, we're being prepared. For what? I'm not entirely certain. But I know it's coming soon, and when it arrives, those of us who've been watching will be ready to serve as bridges between our two species. The transformation has already begun. We just haven't realized it yet. The weight of what we'd uncovered in those buried chambers began to settle on our team like a heavy fog. Dr. Sarah Chen, our lead linguist, had been working around the clock to decode more of the crystalline tablets we'd found embedded in the walls. Each symbol seemed to shift and change when observed directly, as if the very act of reading them altered their meaning. But Sarah had developed a method of looking at them peripherally, catching glimpses of their true form in her peripheral vision. What she discovered changed everything we thought we knew about human history. The tablets spoke of watchers, beings who had observed our species since before the first cities rose from the earth. They described a careful cultivation, a patient guidance that had shaped our development across millennia. The beings weren't invaders or conquerors. They were gardeners, tending to a crop they had planted long ago, and according to the tablets, the harvest was approaching. Sarah's hands trembled as she read the translations aloud to our assembled team. The chamber around us seemed to pulse with a faint energy, responding to the ancient words being spoken after centuries of silence. The air grew thick and charged, like the moments before a thunderstorm breaks. The tablets revealed that these watchers had established contact with selected humans throughout history. Great leaps in technology, sudden bursts of artistic inspiration, mysterious disappearances of brilliant minds who later returned changed. All of it had been part of their careful orchestration. They had been preparing us, testing us, determining our readiness for what they called the Great Integration, but something had gone wrong. The tablets spoke of a schism among the Watchers themselves. Some believed humanity was ready, while others saw us as a failed experiment that needed to be contained or eliminated. The buried chambers we discovered weren't just ancient ruins, they were bunkers, safe houses, communication hubs for a shadow war that had been raging above our heads for generations. As Sarah continued reading, the implications became clear. The recent surge in unexplained encounters, the increase in sightings and contact events wasn't random. It was the opening move in a conflict that would determine the future of both species. The Watchers who favored integration were making themselves known, reaching out to individuals they deemed suitable for contact. They were building a network of human allies for the battle to come. The team worked in shifts, documenting everything we could before word of our discovery leaked to the wrong people. We'd already noticed unmarked vehicles parked at the perimeter of our dig site. Government agents, corporate interests, or something else entirely. We couldn't be sure, but their presence told us we were running out of time. On the fourth night after Sarah's breakthrough, everything changed. I was alone in the main chamber, photographing the wall inscriptions by lamplight, when the symbols began to glow. Not brightly, just a faint phosphorescence that made them easier to read. The temperature in the chamber dropped suddenly, my breath forming clouds in the beam of my headlamp. Then I heard the voice, not spoken aloud, but transmitted directly into my mind with a clarity that made my own thoughts seem muffled by comparison. It spoke in concepts rather than words, downloading information faster than conscious thought could process. I understood that this chamber was more than a repository of historical records. It was a communication device, a way for the Watchers to speak across vast distances and even across time itself. The voice explained that I had been chosen, that my discovery of this place was not an accident, but the culmination of careful guidance spanning years. My fascination with ancient mysteries, my persistence in pursuing, leads others dismissed, even my presence at this specific dig site. All of it had been orchestrated to bring me to this moment. Through the connection, I saw flashes of their true form. They were beings of pure consciousness, having evolved beyond physical bodies eons ago. They existed in a state we could barely comprehend, able to manipulate matter and energy through focused intention alone. But this transcendence came with a price. They had lost something essential in their evolution, something that made existence meaningful rather than merely functional. They had found that missing element in us. Humanity possessed something they had sacrificed in their ascension, the ability to experience genuine emotion, to find joy in simple pleasures, to love without purpose or agenda. We were chaotic and unpredictable, driven by impulses they could no longer feel, and that made us precious beyond measure. The integration they sought wasn't conquest, it was symbiosis. They would share their knowledge and abilities while we would share our capacity for wonder and spontaneous creativity. Together, the combined species would be greater than either could become alone. But the process had to be voluntary, entered into with full understanding of what it meant. That's why they had been so careful in their selection of contact subjects. Each person they approached was evaluated not just for their ability to handle the truth, but for their potential to serve as a bridge between worlds. Some were chosen for their scientific knowledge, others for their empathy or their ability to communicate complex ideas. All of them were being prepared for the moment when open contact became necessary. But that moment was approaching faster than anyone expected. The faction of Watchers who opposed integration was growing more aggressive in their attempts to prevent it. They had resources within human governments and corporations, allies who believed that contact with an advanced species would destabilize human civilization beyond repair. These opponents weren't entirely wrong. The revelation that we were not alone, that we had never been alone, would indeed transform everything about how we saw ourselves and our place in the universe. The voice in my mind showed me images of the other contact sites being established around the world. Similar chambers were being activated in remote locations on every continent. People like me, archaeologists, researchers, and explorers, were being guided to discoveries that would prepare them for their role in what was coming. Each site contained pieces of a larger puzzle, fragments of knowledge that would only make sense when combined with information from the other locations. I understood then that this wasn't just about our small team at this dig site. We were part of a global network being assembled in secret, a collection of humans who would serve as interpreters and advocates when the truth could no longer be hidden. The weight of that responsibility was staggering, but so was the opportunity it represented. The connection lasted for what felt like hours, but was probably only minutes. When it ended, I was left alone in the chamber with a head full of new knowledge and a profound sense of purpose. I knew things now that I couldn't prove, understood concepts that had no equivalent in human language. The symbols on the walls had become readable to me, not through scholarly translation, but through direct comprehension. I also knew that our time at the site was almost over. The opposing faction would not allow these chambers to remain accessible much longer. They had ways of monitoring the activation of the communication devices, and they would move to shut down our operation within days. We needed to gather as much information as possible, and then disappear before they arrived. When I told the team what had happened, their reactions varied from excitement to terror. Some embraced the revelation immediately, understanding instinctively that this was the discovery we had all been working toward our entire careers. Others struggled with the implications, unable to reconcile what I was telling them with their understanding of reality. Sarah was among those who accepted it most readily. She had felt the intelligence behind the shifting symbols, sensed that they were more than mere recordings of past events. The tablets had been trying to communicate with her directly, testing her readiness to receive more complex information. Now that the barriers were down, she could access meanings that had been hidden from purely academic analysis. Dr. Martinez, our geologist, was more skeptical until I showed him how to read the geological data embedded in the chamber walls. The Watchers had recorded the planet's entire seismic history, documenting changes in the Earth's magnetic field and atmospheric composition with precision that surpassed our current instruments. The implications for climate science and natural disaster prediction were revolutionary. But it was the medical information that convinced Dr. Kim, our expedition's physician. The Watchers had been studying human biology for millennia, accumulating knowledge about genetic diseases and potential cures that could eliminate suffering for millions of people. They were willing to share this information freely, asking nothing in return except our cooperation in the integration process. Over the next 2 days, we worked frantically to document everything we could access through the communication device. Each team member was able to interface with the system in their own way, receiving information relevant to their expertise and temperament. The chamber seemed to adapt its communication style to match the recipient's ability to process and understand the data. We learned that the integration process had been attempted before, with mixed results. Some civilizations had embraced the partnership and evolved beyond their homeworlds, becoming part of a vast galactic community of consciousness. Others had rejected the offer and been left to develop naturally, though always under careful observation. A few had been torn apart by the revelation, fragmenting into factions that destroyed themselves before integration could be completed. The Watchers were determined not to let that happen to humanity. They had invested too much time and effort in our development to see us fail at the final stage, but they also couldn't force the process. The integration had to be chosen freely, or it would corrupt both species in ways that could take millennia to correct. That's why the current situation was so delicate. The opposing faction was trying to prevent integration by exposing the Watchers' presence prematurely, before enough humans had been prepared to serve as bridges between the species. They believed that a sudden, chaotic revelation would cause humanity to reject the partnership out of fear and xenophobia. The pro-integration faction was racing to establish enough contact points to ensure that when disclosure became inevitable, there would be trusted human voices to explain what was happening and why it represented an opportunity rather than a threat. But time was running out for the careful, gradual approach they preferred. On our final night at the site, the chamber delivered its most important message. The integration process was about to begin whether humanity was ready or not. The opposing faction had forced the timeline by threatening to expose the Watchers' presence in the most destructive way possible. Rather than allow that to happen, the pro-integration group had decided to initiate contact openly, trusting that enough humans had been prepared to help guide the species through the transition. Within months, possibly weeks, the existence of the Watchers would become public knowledge. Governments would be forced to acknowledge what they had known and hidden for decades. The carefully maintained veil of secrecy would be torn away, and humanity would have to confront the reality that we had never been alone in the universe. Those of us who had been contacted through sites like this chamber would become crucial in helping our species navigate that revelation. We would be the ones called upon to explain not just the existence of the Watchers, but their intentions and the opportunities that partnership with them could provide. The knowledge we had gained would need to be shared carefully, helping humanity understand that this was not an invasion to be resisted, but an invitation to be considered. The chamber showed us one final image before the connection ended. It was a vision of Earth as seen from space, but not as we knew it now. This was Earth after integration, its surface dotted with structures that seemed to grow from the landscape itself rather than being imposed upon it. The skies were filled with vessels that moved without visible propulsion, carrying beings that were recognizably human, but transformed by their partnership with the Watchers. It was a future of unimaginable possibility, where the limitations of biology and physics as we understood them no longer applied. Disease and aging could be conquered, consciousness could exist independently of physical form, and the barriers between individual minds could be lowered to allow true empathy and understanding. The Watchers had achieved all of this, and they were offering to share it with us, but the choice was ours to make, and that choice was coming sooner than any of us had imagined. Part 13. The Weight of Contact. The call came through our encrypted channels at exactly 3:17 a.m. Pacific Standard Time. I was already awake, staring at reports that made less sense with each passing hour, missing time incidents, equipment failures with no logical explanation, personnel requesting transfers from locations they couldn't adequately describe as problematic. The voice on the other end was calm, professional, but I could hear the tremor underneath. "We have a situation at Site 7. We need someone with your clearance level." Site 7. I knew the designation, though I'd never been there. high-altitude research facility, officially studying atmospheric phenomena. Unofficially, it was where we sent the cases that didn't fit anywhere else, the ones that made seasoned investigators request desk jobs. The flight took 6 hours, crossing time zones and landscape that grew increasingly desolate. When the helicopter finally set down on the landing pad carved into the mountainside, the sun was setting behind peaks that seemed to stretch into infinity. The facility itself was modest, just a cluster of buildings connected by covered walkways, everything painted the same institutional gray that government architects seem to love. Dr. Sarah Chen met me at the entrance, her credentials impressive enough to make me wonder why she'd accepted a posting this remote MIT doctorate, published researcher, the kind of mind that usually stayed in comfortable university positions. But her handshake was firm, her eyes direct, and when she spoke about the work they were doing here, there was an intensity that suggested this wasn't just another assignment for her. "The signals started 3 weeks ago," she explained, as we walked through corridors lined with equipment I couldn't begin to identify. Initially, we thought it was interference from solar activity, but the patterns were too regular, too complex, and then the dreams began. I stopped walking. Dreams? Every member of the research team, the same dream, experienced on the same nights. We're standing in a vast space, surrounded by beings of light. They don't speak, but we understand them. They're trying to teach us something, but we can't quite grasp what it is. We wake up with fragments of equations, mathematical concepts that are just beyond our comprehension. The main laboratory was a circular room dominated by banks of computers and monitoring equipment. Screens showed waveforms and data streams that meant nothing to me, but Dr. Chen moved between them with practiced ease, pointing out anomalies and patterns that had emerged over the past weeks. "The signals aren't random," she continued. "They're responsive. When we change our transmission frequencies, they adjust accordingly. When we introduce new mathematical sequences, they elaborate on them, showing us implications we hadn't considered. It's like having a conversation with an intelligence that operates on a level we can barely perceive." I studied the data, looking for any conventional explanation. Could this be some kind of experimental technology? Another government's research program? Dr. Chen shook her head. "The sophistication level is decades beyond anything in our current scientific literature, and there's something else." She led me to a smaller room where 3 researchers sat at monitoring stations, their faces illuminated by the soft glow of screens. They looked exhausted, but there was something else in their expressions, a kind of wonder mixed with fear. "Show him the recordings from last night," Dr. Chen instructed. One of the researchers, a young man who introduced himself as Marcus, pulled up audio files on his computer. We started recording the team's sleep patterns after the dreams became consistent. Listen to this. The audio was unsettling. 6 people, sleeping in separate quarters, all speaking simultaneously during REM sleep. But they weren't speaking English, or any human language I'd ever heard. The sounds were melodic, almost musical, but with undertones that seemed to vibrate in frequencies just below normal hearing range. "They're all saying the same thing," Marcus explained. "The same phrases, the same intonations, perfectly synchronized. But when they wake up, none of them remember speaking. They only remember the dreams." I felt a chill that had nothing to do with the mountain air. "Have you attempted to translate what they're saying?" "We've tried," Dr. Chen replied, "but it doesn't match any known linguistic patterns. However, when we play the recordings back through our computer analysis systems, they register as containing mathematical information, complex equations related to quantum mechanics and dimensional theory." Over the following days, I observed the team's routine. During daylight hours, they worked with focused intensity. analyzing the signals and attempting to decode their meaning. But as night approached, a different energy settled over the facility. The researchers became quieter, more introspective, as if preparing for something they couldn't quite name. On my third night there, I experienced the dreams myself. I was standing in a space that seemed to exist outside normal reality. The boundaries were undefined, shifting between what looked like a vast cathedral and an infinite library. The beings were there, as Dr. Chen had described, but calling them beings of light was inadequate. They were consciousness given form, intelligence that existed without the limitations of physical bodies. They didn't communicate through words or even thoughts as I understood them. Instead, knowledge flowed directly from their presence into my awareness. I understood, with absolute clarity, that they had been trying to make contact for decades. Not through dramatic displays or invasive interventions, but through gradual introduction of concepts that would prepare humanity for a larger understanding of reality. The dreams, the signals, the strange experiences reported around the world, they were all part of a careful process. These beings understood that direct contact would cause panic, chaos, the collapse of social and religious structures. So they worked slowly, influencing minds that were ready to receive their guidance, gradually expanding human consciousness to prepare for eventual open communication. But something had gone wrong. The process was accelerating beyond their intended pace. Other forces, other intelligences were interfering with their careful plan. Some wanted to speed up the timeline, to force contact before humanity was ready. Others wanted to prevent it entirely, seeing human development as a threat to their own interests. When I woke, the knowledge remained. Not just fragments or impressions, but complete understanding of what we were dealing with. The researchers were experiencing the same clarity. We gathered in the main laboratory, and without discussion began working on problems that would have taken months to solve under normal circumstances. Dr. Chen was the first to voice what we were all thinking. They're using us as conduits. Our minds have been expanded to serve as bridges between their level of consciousness and human understanding. The implications were staggering. We weren't just receiving information, we were being transformed. Our neural pathways were being rewired to accommodate concepts that human brains weren't naturally equipped to process. It should have been terrifying, but instead, it felt like awakening from a long sleep. Over the following weeks, we made breakthroughs that would have taken the scientific community decades to achieve independently. New understanding of quantum mechanics, revolutionary approaches to energy generation, insights into the nature of consciousness itself. But with each advancement, we could feel ourselves changing, becoming something that was no longer entirely human. The weight of contact wasn't in the dramatic moment of first seeing alien beings. It was in the gradual realization that contact had been happening all along, subtle and patient, reshaping humanity from within. We were being prepared for something larger, but the preparation itself was changing us in ways we couldn't fully comprehend. Some nights, I would stand outside the facility and look up at the stars, knowing with absolute certainty that intelligences beyond our imagination were looking back. The universe was vast and populated with minds that had been waiting patiently for humanity to develop enough to join a larger community of consciousness. But we weren't ready. Not yet. The process needed more time, more careful guidance, and there were forces working to ensure that time might not be available. The weight of contact was the understanding that everything we thought we knew about our place in the universe was about to change, and we were among the first to bear the responsibility of preparing our species for that transformation. The dreams continued, growing more complex each night. We were being taught, prepared, gradually transformed into something that could serve as a bridge between worlds. But bridges, by their very nature, belong fully to neither side. We were becoming something new, something that existed in the space between human and other. And in that space we carried the weight of humanity's future, one dream at a time. The voices started small at first, just whispers threading through the static of my radio during those long midnight patrols. I'd been working security at the industrial complex for 3 years, and the equipment was old, temperamental. Static was normal. Voices bleeding through from distant CB channels, that was normal too. But these whispers felt different, like they were meant for me, specifically, cutting through the white noise with surgical precision. It was always the same time, around 2:30 in the morning, when the world felt heaviest and most alone. The complex stretched out in all directions. Empty warehouses and loading docks bathed in the harsh glow of sodium lights. My rounds took me past the same checkpoints, the same locked doors, the same shadows that never quite looked the same twice. The first time I heard them clearly, I was sitting in the security office, half dozing over a cup of coffee that had gone cold hours ago. The radio crackled, and through the static came a single word, spoken so softly I almost missed it. Listen. I sat up, suddenly alert, scanning the bank of monitors that showed empty hallways and vacant lots. Nothing moved. I keyed the radio, following protocol. Base to all units, radio check. Silence. I was the only guard on duty. The whispers came again the next night and the night after that. Always around 2:30, always just on the edge of comprehension. Sometimes it sounded like my name being called from very far away. Sometimes it was fragments of conversations in a language I didn't recognize, all soft consonants and flowing vowels that seemed to bypass my ears and speak directly to something deeper. I started keeping a notebook, writing down what I heard. The entries were frustrating, full of question marks and half-remembered phrases. Something about watching. Coordinates, maybe. They know I'm here. By the end of the first week, I'd convinced myself it was just fatigue, the kind of auditory hallucinations that come from too many overnight shifts and not enough sleep. But then the patterns started becoming clear. The whispers weren't random interference. They were structured, purposeful, like someone was trying to teach me a new language, one word at a time. The breakthrough came on a Thursday night when the autumn fog rolled in thick and heavy, reducing visibility to maybe 20 feet. I was making my rounds, flashlight cutting weak cones through the mist, when the radio erupted with the clearest transmission yet. "The markers are in place," a voice said, crisp and immediate. "Phase 1 is complete." I stopped walking, heart hammering against my ribs. This wasn't a whisper bleeding through static. This was a direct communication, clear as if someone was standing right next to me. "Who is this?" I said into the radio. "Identify yourself." The response came immediately, and it wasn't what I expected. "You've been chosen to observe," the voice said. "Your reports are valuable to us." Reports? I hadn't filed any reports beyond the standard security logs. Nothing unusual ever happened here, nothing worth reporting. "I don't understand," I said, but the radio had gone silent again, leaving only the familiar hiss of static. That's when I started noticing the markers they'd mentioned. Small things, easy to miss unless you were looking for them. Scratches on loading dock doors that formed geometric patterns. Pieces of reflective tape stuck to fence posts at precise intervals. Chalk marks on concrete that seemed to appear overnight and disappear just as quickly. The complex I thought I knew, the empty industrial wasteland I'd been patrolling for 3 years, was being systematically mapped and cataloged by someone. And somehow I'd become part of their process. The voices started coming more frequently after that. no longer confined to the dead hours around 2:30. They'd crackle through during my afternoon shifts, brief transmissions that felt like status updates. Grid 7 complete. Anomaly detected in Sector 12. Observer remains unaware. That last one stung. Observer remains unaware. They were talking about me, and they assumed I didn't understand what was happening. Maybe they were right. Maybe I was just a security guard stumbling through something far beyond my comprehension. But I started paying closer attention. I began photographing the markers with my phone, documenting their locations, trying to understand the pattern. What I found was a grid system overlaying the entire complex, with measurement points that seemed designed to track something moving beneath the ground. The realization hit me during a particularly quiet night shift in November. I was reviewing the photos I'd taken, connecting the dots literally, when the pattern emerged. The markers weren't just random surveillance points. They were forming a map of underground tunnels that didn't appear on any of the complex's official blueprints. I'd been walking over them for 3 years, never knowing they existed. The next transmission confirmed my suspicions. Tunnel network fully mapped, the voice reported. Infrastructure assessment complete. Ready for Phase 2. I found myself speaking into the radio before I could stop myself. "I know about the tunnels," I said. The silence that followed was different from the usual static-filled quiet. This was the silence of someone listening, considering, making a decision. When the voice came back, it was addressing me directly for the first time. "We know you know," it said. "That's why you were selected." Selected. Not hired as a security guard. Selected for something else entirely. Selected for what? I asked. To witness, to document, to serve as proof that contact was made. The words sent ice through my veins. Contact. They weren't talking about human surveillance or corporate espionage. They were talking about something else entirely, something that required witnesses and documentation and carefully placed markers in the dark. "Who are you?" I whispered into the radio. "We are the ones who have been waiting," came the reply. "And you are the one who will remember." The transmission cut out, leaving me alone in the security office with the weight of understanding settling on my shoulders like a lead blanket. I wasn't just a security guard patrolling an empty industrial complex. I was a witness to something that had been planned for years, maybe decades. The markers, the voices, the careful mapping of underground spaces. They were all preparation for something larger, and I'd been chosen to watch it happen, to serve as proof that it was real when others inevitably claimed it never occurred. Over the following weeks, the nature of the transmissions changed. Instead of status updates and coordination chatter, I started receiving what could only be described as briefings. Information about the purpose of the tunnels, the significance of the markers, the timeline for whatever was coming next. They told me about the others like me, security guards and night watchmen and graveyard shift workers across the country who'd been selected to serve as witnesses. A network of observers documenting the same careful preparations in industrial complexes and abandoned buildings and forgotten corners of cities where no one important ever went. We were the early warning system, they explained. The proof that contact had been established and protocol followed. When the time came for broader revelation, our testimonies would serve as evidence that the process had been gradual, careful, respectful of human institutions and procedures. They were following rules, I realized. Some kind of cosmic bureaucracy that required witnesses and documentation and proper channels. They couldn't just appear in the sky above major cities. They had to work through established systems, leave paper trails, create a record of legitimate contact that couldn't be dismissed or covered up. And they needed people like me to verify that the process had been followed correctly. The voices still come through my radio, though less frequently now. Mostly they're just check-ins, confirmation that I'm still here, still watching, still ready to serve my purpose when the time comes. Sometimes they share updates about the other observers, how the preparation is progressing in other locations. The tunnels beneath the complex are active now. I can feel the vibrations through the concrete during my rounds, subtle tremors that suggest machinery moving far below. The markers have evolved, too, becoming more sophisticated, incorporating elements that seem to respond to proximity by glowing faintly when I approach. I don't know when Phase 2 will begin, or what it will look like when it does, but I know I'll be here to witness it, to document it, to serve as proof that it happened exactly as planned. The voices have made that clear. This is my role in something much larger than myself, larger than this complex, larger than anything I ever imagined when I took this job. I keep detailed logs now, not just of what I hear on the radio, but of everything I observe, the patterns, the changes, the gradual transformation of a place I thought I knew into something entirely different. When the time comes to testify about what happened here, I'll be ready. The voices chose their witnesses well. We're the kind of people who work alone, who notice details, who understand the importance of accurate documentation. We're credible precisely because we're ordinary, because we have nothing to gain from fabricating such an elaborate story. And we're patient. We understand that some things can't be rushed, that proper procedures must be followed, that contact between worlds requires careful planning and meticulous execution. The whispers continue, threading through the static of my radio in the deep hours of the night, reminding me that I'm part of something larger now, something that started with carefully placed markers and will end with proof that cannot be denied or dismissed. I am an observer. I am a witness. And when the time comes, I will remember everything. The patterns were becoming undeniable. Every report I collected, every witness I interviewed, every piece of evidence I cataloged pointed to something far more organized than random encounters. These weren't isolated incidents scattered across time and geography. They were coordinated, deliberate, part of something larger that had been unfolding right under our noses for decades, maybe longer. I spent weeks correlating the data, cross-referencing locations, dates, and witness descriptions. The mathematical precision was staggering. The lights appeared in specific sequences. The encounters followed predictable patterns. The missing time episodes occurred at calculated intervals. It was like watching a massive, invisible clockwork mechanism tick away in the darkness, marking time toward some predetermined moment. The underground chambers weren't random either. Every site I investigated showed the same crystalline formations, the same harmonic frequencies, the same electromagnetic anomalies. They formed a network stretching across continents, connected by energy signatures that pulsed in synchronized rhythms. Whatever intelligence was behind this had been methodically preparing our world for something. Dr. Elena Vasquez was the first scientist willing to go on record about the biological evidence. She'd spent 15 years analyzing tissue samples, genetic markers, and cellular structures that defied conventional understanding. Her laboratory in Colorado became an unofficial clearinghouse for the physical proof that governments and institutions refused to acknowledge. The genetic modifications are subtle but consistent, she told me during our 3-hour interview. We're seeing changes in human DNA that shouldn't be possible through natural evolution. Markers that suggest deliberate intervention, enhancement. The subjects don't even realize they've been altered. She showed me microscopic images that looked like alien script written into our chromosomes, sequences that activated dormant regions of the brain, modifications that increased psychic sensitivity, enhanced pattern recognition, expanded consciousness in ways we were only beginning to understand. "They're not abducting us," she said quietly. "They're upgrading us, preparing us for integration into something bigger than we can imagine." The Dream Network was perhaps the most disturbing discovery. Thousands of people across the globe reporting identical visions, shared experiences that occurred simultaneously despite being separated by vast distances. The blue rooms, the elongated figures, the sense of ancient knowledge being downloaded directly into sleeping minds. I started mapping these dream encounters and found they clustered around the same geographical coordinates as the underground sites, the electromagnetic anomalies, the UFO sightings. Everything was connected in a web of influence that spanned the entire planet. Sarah Chen, a neuroscientist at Stanford, had been secretly studying the brainwave patterns of dream contactees. Her findings were revolutionary and terrifying. Their neural activity shows synchronization patterns that shouldn't exist, she explained. It's as if their consciousness is being linked to a collective network, a hive mind that operates beyond our current understanding of human cognition. The implications were staggering. If these beings could influence our dreams, access our memories, modify our genetics, and coordinate their activities across global networks, then the traditional concept of alien invasion was laughably obsolete. This wasn't conquest through force. It was transformation through patience. Military whistleblowers began reaching out to me, sharing classified documents that painted a picture of official knowledge stretching back to the 1940s. Secret programs designed not to defend against extraterrestrial contact, but to manage and facilitate it. The crashes, the retrievals, the cover-ups weren't about hiding alien technology from the public. They were about controlling the pace of disclosure, ensuring humanity's transition happened gradually, carefully, without causing societal collapse. Colonel James Morrison, recently retired from a black budget program he couldn't officially name, met me in a diner outside Las Vegas. His hand shook as he slid a manila envelope across the table. "We've been partners with them for 70 years, he said. "Joint operations, technology exchange. They help us advance our capabilities and we help them advance their agenda." The envelope contained photographs of underground facilities where human and alien scientists worked side by side. Documents outlining breeding programs designed to create hybrid offspring. Technical specifications for craft that combined human engineering with extraterrestrial propulsion systems. Evidence of a collaboration so deep and extensive that the line between human and alien interests had completely blurred. "The end game isn't invasion," Morrison continued. "It's evolution. They're steering our development towards something they call convergence, a merging of our species into something new, something better, they claim." The time frame was accelerating. Witnesses reported increased activity, more frequent encounters, bolder displays of technology. The beings were becoming less concerned with secrecy, more willing to reveal themselves to larger groups. It was as if they were preparing for a final phase, a moment when the careful orchestration of decades would culminate in open contact. Religious leaders across different faiths had been receiving visions, messages that spoke of transformation and transcendence. Ancient prophecies suddenly took on new meaning when viewed through the lens of extraterrestrial intervention. The Second Coming, the Age of Enlightenment, the evolution of consciousness, all reframed as humanity's graduation into a galactic community. Father Michael Santos, a Catholic priest in New Mexico, described his encounter with beings of light who claimed to be the same entities that had guided human spiritual development for millennia. "They showed me the true history," he said, "how they've been with us since the beginning, nudging us toward this moment when we're ready to join them among the stars." The technology was already here, hidden in plain sight. Advances in artificial intelligence, quantum computing, genetic engineering, all accelerated by reverse-engineered alien science. The smartphones in our pockets, the satellites orbiting our planet, the medical devices saving lives in hospitals, all contained elements of extraterrestrial innovation seamlessly integrated into human technology. Dr. Richard Hawthorne, a former researcher at Bell Labs, revealed how breakthrough discoveries were often preceded by mysterious consultations with unnamed advisors. We'd hit walls in our research, fundamental barriers that seemed impossible to overcome. Then someone would appear, offer insights that revolutionized our understanding, and disappear again. We were told they were from classified government programs, but now I realize the truth was far stranger. The economic systems were being prepared as well. Cryptocurrency, global interconnectedness, the erosion of national boundaries, all part of a gradual restructuring that would ease humanity's transition into a post-contact civilization. The beings understood that sudden revelation would cause chaos, so they'd been slowly reshaping our world to accommodate the reality they were about to reveal. Children born in the last 2 decades showed remarkable abilities: enhanced intuition, telepathic sensitivity, an instinctive understanding of complex scientific principles. Parents reported their kids drawing pictures of star maps they'd never seen, speaking about sky friends with surprising detail and consistency. These children weren't afraid of the unknown. They were excited about it, as if they'd been born knowing this moment was coming. The signs were everywhere for those willing to see them. Mass animal migrations following unusual patterns, electromagnetic anomalies affecting global communications, weather systems behaving in ways that defied meteorological models. The planet itself seemed to be preparing for something momentous. Government disclosure programs, once dismissed as conspiracy theories, were now official policy. Military videos of unidentified aerial phenomena released to the public. Congressional hearings on UFO encounters. Official acknowledgement that we were indeed not alone. But even these revelations felt carefully orchestrated, designed to prepare public consciousness for something far more significant. The final phase was beginning. All the patience, all the preparation, all the careful manipulation of human development was leading to a moment of convergence that would redefine our species' place in the universe. We weren't facing an invasion. We were approaching a graduation. The question that remained was whether humanity was truly ready for what came next, or if we were simply passengers on a journey that had been planned for us long before we even realized we were traveling.